I'm here with Dennis Peters. He recently wrote a book, Behavior and Culture in One Dimension. It came out early 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic. It's an excellent book. I loved it. And we're here to discuss how the recent developments in GPT-4 and AGI relate to his book. So, Dennis, can you introduce yourself and say something about your book?
Sure. Thanks, Carlos. Happy to be here. Dennis Waters, and here's the book, Behavior and Culture in One Dimension. This is based on work I did in a PhD program about 30 to 40 years ago. My PhD advisor was Howard Pattee. For those of you who don't know Pattee, he is a biophysicist. He's hanging in there very well. He's well into his 90s. Still publishing and still a great conversationalist, and his work was primarily focused on trying to understand the cell as an information processing system, and he has a series of papers going back all the way to the mid 1960s covering these topics. There is a book of his which I will plug as long as we're here. Laws, Language, and Life. This is a compilation of his papers that came out about 10 years ago, published by Springer, and but many of these papers are also available on the internet, and you can grab them if you want to follow his work a little more closely. So I got detoured from the academic world and founded a number of technical publishing businesses. And when I retired a few years ago, I decided to pick up where I left off, and the result was the book Behavior and Culture in One Dimension. And what I've tried to do there is sort of build on a foundation of Howard Pattee's work, and essentially extend that work beyond the cell and into culture and civilization.
Howard Pattee has a very interesting formulation of how to separate physics from biology. And it's usually this idea of how biology is different from physics perplexes many. So I was wondering if you could explain how Pattee formulates what he calls the epistemic cut.
Sure. Well, the epistemic cut is really derived from quantum physics originally. It started with Heisenberg, who called it the Schnitt, which is German for cut, and Heisenberg viewed it as the cutting point. If you can think of a point at which the measuring device and the system being measured are split apart. So you've got a system being measured, you've got a measuring device, and the interface between those two things, where the behavior of the system being measured is usually converted into some kind of a symbol, a readout of some kind by a measuring device. So that's the Schnitt. Now, von Neumann, who and Pattee was an enormous fan of von Neumann and cites him frequently, not only his work in quantum physics but also the theory of self-reproducing automata, but von Neumann had a problem with the Schnitt, which he said essentially you've got a system being measured, you've got a measuring device. The system being measured is a quantum system, but hey, the measuring device is also a quantum system. So you have to sort of put them together as a composite quantum system, and then you need another measuring device to measure this new composite system that combines the original system being measured and the original measuring device. But hey, the new measuring device is also a quantum system. So von Neumann's critique of this was that you get an infinite regress of these measuring devices because they're all quantum systems. So where do you actually place the Schnitt, or place what Pattee would call the epistemic cut? And von Neumann said, well, that's at the mind of the observer. And so he has taken a problem that's difficult to begin with and explained it in terms of the mind of the observer, which is probably more difficult as well. Now, Pattee's view of this is more evolutionary, in the sense that if you go back to the origin of life, and you go back to the prebiotic Earth, where all you had was physics, well, there was no measurement going on there. There was no Schnitt, there was no epistemic cut. And at some point, you wind up with an epistemic cut. Now, Pattee views this as being sort of the distinction between the mind and the brain, or between the subject and the object, or between the dancer and the dance. And in the cell, which is what Pattee studied, it's really this question of, you've got a sequence of DNA, which provides the template for constructing a protein, but you also need that protein in order to transcribe and translate the DNA sequence. So you have this circularity, and it's difficult in a circular system of that kind exactly where you're going to place an epistemic cut. But at the origin of life, there must have been some point at which this cut emerged. In other words, at some point at which the prebiotic Earth, which was operating just under the laws of geophysics and geochemistry, where that prebiotic Earth suddenly produced some kind of a measurement process, and this epistemic cut came into being. So that's probably the best summation I can give. It's sort of two parts. One is trying to understand where you would put an epistemic cut in a cycle where you've got a DNA that's being processed by a protein, but you need the protein to do that, and the DNA also specifies the construction of the protein. And the other, of course, is the origin of this epistemic cut.
Now, in your book, you do mention something about the distinction between a time-dependent system and a time-independent system. Could you explain that?
I think this was one of Pattee's greatest contributions. He talked about the difference between rate independence and rate dependence. And anytime you're talking about sequences, whether they're sequences of DNA or sequences of text or sequences of code, you're really talking about rate independence. In other words, the process that these sequences are going through is not necessarily dependent on the rate at which this process takes place, and that is contrasted with the rate-dependent process of anything that's happening in physics. So you can think of a computer processing some sort of a calculation, and if you put a faster processor into the computer and you give it more memory, well, it's going to do that calculation faster, but it is not going to change the outcome of the calculation. The outcome of the calculation should stay the same. So the fact that the outcome is the same regardless of the change in rate makes that something that's rate independent. And that is a characteristic of cells processing DNA, of humans processing text, and of computers processing code. Rate dependence is something more like ordinary everyday physics, like a 100-meter relay. Whoever runs the fastest is going to win that race, and the outcome is going to be very sensitive to changes in rate among the various runners. I think the example that I've always been fondest of in looking at rate dependence versus rate independence is the idea of getting a driving license. Normally, you would have two types of tests that you have to take to get a driver's license. They usually give you what's called a written test, and then you also have a road test. And for the written test, you sit down and you answer a bunch of questions. And for the road test, you get behind the wheel and you drive the car around some simulated track with an inspector of some kind to grade you on your ability. Well, if you've got a test to get a driving license, and let's say you've got 60 minutes allocated for that, and half that time is going to be for the written test and half the time is for the road test, you could easily finish the written test in much less than the allotted time. So if you finish the written test in 15 minutes versus the 30 minutes that's allocated, you can quite easily pass the test if you've been studying your manual and all that sort of thing. So you can pass the test if you do it in half the time. However, if you try to take the road test in half the time, that means you're going to be speeding and braking and doing all kinds of maneuvers that are going to terrify the inspector, and you're not going to pass the test. So this is a case in which is rate dependent, and the outcome is very much dependent on the fact that you've taken less time than the 30 minutes allocated. So it's an important distinction from looking at the world of sequences of DNA or sequences of text or sequences of code versus the physical world, in which you wind up with functions that have time, time t as in the denominator.
So if biological cognition and computers belong to the same rate independent category, how do you actually differentiate the two?
Well, biological cognition, it's not entirely clear. It's not entirely clear that biological cognition is completely rate independent. Certainly, the sequence processing component of that is rate independent. I mean, I would say the major distinction between biological cognition and computers is historical. Software engineering is an ahistorical discipline, and software engineers, I mean, there are traditions and there are best practices and there are constant improvements in operating systems and languages and so forth. But essentially, the software engineer can start every project fresh and anew without necessarily having to rely on what's happened in the past. Biological cognition, on the other hand, is profoundly historical. That is, everything about biological cognition is built on several billion years of evolution that has created a body that can perceive and that can behave. And what we see as cognition is really something that is layered on top of this legacy system. We have a legacy biological system of a body and a brain and a lot of processing that's going on in sort of the subconscious. So biological cognition, I would say, is very ahistorical, or is historical, I should say, and computation is much more ahistorical. That is, you can kind of start fresh with it, and you don't have all of this legacy hardware like we do. I mean, there's a lot that's going on. We clearly don't know how brains work very well. We know a little bit more about the cell and how information processing takes place in the cell, but even there, it's dependent on the behavior, the complex behavior of a lot of very large molecular aggregates that we don't fully understand that well. So things like ribosomes and spliceosomes and the conformations of chromosomes and that kind of thing. So there's a lot going on there that is not necessarily what you would call rate independent in a classic Pattee sense. There's stuff that's going on that's very much rate independent, and they're kind of entangled. I mean, this is one of the points I make in the book is in biological systems, you have an entanglement between the rate independent and the rate dependent. So it's not quite as easy to make that distinction.
Okay, right. With the emergence of GPT-4 like systems that are based on a transformer model, which essentially works on one-dimensional information, how does that actually relate with your book that revolves around this idea of a one-dimensional information?
Well, certainly the distinction that we were just talking about between rate independence and rate dependence fits this very closely, because GPT models are all completely rate independent, in the sense that you're dealing with textual inputs, you're dealing with textual outputs, and you're dealing with sequences of zeros and ones in the code that run the whole thing. So there is no real rate dependence associated with GPT models. Now, you can take that wherever you like. I tend to take it in the direction of thinking about text, because there is a long-standing issue, as certainly in my view and in the view of some others, with the confusion of language and text. That is, text is used as a synonym for a language, or when we're dealing with a body of text, we say, well, this is language, or this is natural language, or this is a linguistic input. But text is kind of peculiar. There's a very interesting book that was written a few years back by a Scandinavian linguist called the written language bias in linguistics. The written language bias in linguistics, and linguistics tends to view this the same way. They tend to look at text and say, well, this is language. This is what we have produced. But of course, text and speech are very, very different. With text, you're dealing with something that is largely rate independent. But with spoken language, which is the older of the two forms, you're dealing with something that is much more entangled with rate dependence. So you've got a combination of sequence and dynamics with language, and that is more native to the human speaker. I can show you this. Think about this. Just watch my face and think about this. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. Now, if I were to ask you what you would just answered, you'd ask me a question and that was my answer, which would you consider to be the more likely true answer? In other words, I was saying the word yes, but at the same time, I was shaking my head no. And a lot of people that I talk to, you can answer for yourself, but a lot of people that I talk to when I do that say, well, the no is somehow overriding the yes. You would say that the no, which is simply a gesture, it's just a dynamic rate dependent gesture, is overriding that. So there's a sense in which the entanglement of dynamics in language and in speech is something that any kind of a system, such as a GPT model that is based strictly on rate-independent text, is not going to be able to capture. So there's a whole level of human communication that is not available to it. That is this entangled part of the rate-dependent and the rate-independent. So the fact that you've got and different people will have different views. Obviously, you can go out and read what people are writing about this. The extent to which enormous corpuses of text can capture everything that we need to know about human cognition, about human knowledge, about human emotion, that can all be captured in text. My argument would be, no, it can't all be captured in text. There's a lot that can be captured in text. And clearly we are, if you think about what it must have been like, it's almost impossible to think of what it must have been like to be in a pre-literate culture 10,000 years ago, living with people who have speech. They probably have complex speech. They have certainly the brains and the bodies that are equivalent to what we have today, but they had no text. They had no writing. And so all the things that we come to associate with writing were non-existent to them. So there was no spelling. You didn't worry how to spell things. There was no spelling. You don't have to worry how to pronounce things. Things were just pronounced. So grammar and parts of speech, all the things that all the apparatus, the analytical apparatus that we have built around text to help clarify what we're doing and be more explicit and all that sort of thing, that was simply absent from. There was no history, there was no mathematics, there was no computation. So all of these things were absent to such a culture. And we, because we're so much embedded in a textual civilization, we're kind of ignorant of that. It's like the proverbial fish in the water. The fish doesn't know what the water is. And we don't really appreciate the extent to which everything that we do and the way we think about language and the way we think about cognition has been infiltrated by text. But text is a relatively recent invention of the human species. I mean, and both in terms of phylogeny, because it's only been around for maybe 5,000 years, as opposed to perhaps hundreds of thousands for speech, and also for ontogeny, because people learn to speak. They learn language very naturally in a native way from their parents and their caregivers. But text and learning to read and write is something that has to be more or less forced upon them in an educational setting, and it's much less natural to learn those formal rules of text. So I think that to get back to your original question, I mean, I think the book, by focusing on the difference between text and speech, and by focusing on the distinctions between the rate independent and the rate dependent and how they're entangled, I think it provides an interesting window on GPT models.
In your book, you have chapters that explore the notion of constraints, chapter on interaction, grammar of extension, and grammar of abstraction. I was wondering if you could possibly just go through that and to see how that may inform the notion of or the possibility of something like a GPT-like system evolving into a more advanced kind of general intelligence.
Well, I'll try to summarize these three different grammars. So there's a grammar of interaction, a grammar of extension, and a grammar of abstraction that I discuss in these chapters. The grammar of interaction is simply the fact that in language we have nouns and verbs are generally considered to be the most primitive objects of language by most linguists, and they refer really, if you think of what a noun is, a noun is typically an object of perception, at least in its most concrete form, and a verb represents some kind of a behavior or some kind of an action. So it's really the coupling of perception and action that provides some kind of interaction. And this is how we get around in the world, and this is how the metabolism of a cell operates. If you think about enzymes, I mean, enzymes are, this is Pattee's work here, but enzymes recognize, have a perceptual apparatus, a way of recognizing other molecules, and then they have an action, which is to catalyze some reaction involving their substrate molecule. So it's this combination of perception and action that is really crucial to interaction, and it's also fundamental to grammar. So what we're looking for here is we're looking for something that's going on in the world, which is something that you can see or perceive, and something that you can execute a behavior against, and something that's in the structure of the language, in the grammar. And in this case, interaction is in the grammar because it's combining the nouns and the verbs. The grammar of extension goes beyond that, because if you think about animal communication, and you think about probably the very earliest human communication when speech was just emerging, there's a linguist called Talmy Gavone who calls this the tyranny of context. That is, that the earliest language was very much dependent on what was going on in the immediate surroundings, what was happening in the here and now, the very time-bound and space-bound, as the physicist Max Delbruck would have said. But our grammar has allowed us, largely through constructions of things like prepositions. I mean, one of the funny things about prepositions is that it's virtually impossible to coin a new preposition. You know, you could give that some thought, but all the prepositions, they're really a fixed set in a way that many of the other aspects of our language are not, such as nouns and verbs. You can always coin new nouns and coin new verbs.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we're doing that all the time. But the prepositions are kind of a fixed set, and they give a conceptual structure to language and allow us to extend language distant in time and space and in terms of probability. So you also have with verbs, you have what are called modals. These are verbs like might and could and should and would and will and can and must. So these are all relate to the probabilities of various actions. So you can assign probabilities to things. You can talk about things that are distant in time and space using these prepositions and modals and so forth from fixed sets. So that's the grammar of extension, and that is one of the first things that allows our language to escape the immediate context. And finally, you have the grammar of abstraction, and this is related to regulatory systems and the fact that you can have a word like freedom, which is clearly a noun and clearly works in our grammar as if it were a noun, but clearly does not refer to anything in particular that you can point to or that you can execute a behavior against in an ordinary everyday context. And yet it's a very powerful word, and obviously has had enormous repercussions over the course of history. But freedom is much more abstract, and we find systems in the cell that are gene regulatory networks that operate in very similar ways, in which you have cascades of enzymes that are regulating various processes, and you may have a very high level enzyme that doesn't really do anything except regulate the activity of many other enzymes in one of these cascades. And so these are sort of abstract in the same way that freedom is. And so language allows us to have these regulatory systems in which one word or a set of words can unleash a very large number of subsequent processes. Obviously, I've tried to summarize 3 chapters in just a few words here, so I hope I've done okay with that. As for how this all applies to general intelligence, I mean, I'm not 100% comfortable with the use of the word general. I much prefer the word universal, and I think of things like the universal laws of physics, and I think about the universal Turing machine as 2 examples of universality. Now, I think when people are talking about general intelligence, I kind of get the impression that they mean universal intelligence. Mm-hmm. And I sort of wish they would just say universal intelligence, but general intelligence seems to be what they like. You know, I guess there are 2 questions. One is whether there is anything like universal intelligence or general intelligence that actually exists. And the other is that if it does exist, does a GPT model provide a useful simulation of that? I guess as a biologist, I would say that biology does very little that is universal. The only universal things in biology are the genetic code, the molecules that process the genetic code, the ribosomes, the spliceosomes, the polymerases, synthetases, and all those sets of enzymes. So those are all universal throughout life, but most of the rest of life is not characterized by universality, it's characterized by diversity. And so if you're thinking about intelligence that has evolved in a biological sense, I think you would be hard pressed to say that it was universal. I would say that it is much likely to be more specific. I mean, the evolutionary psychologists use the metaphor of the brain not being like a computer, but rather being like a Swiss Army knife, with a lot of subsets, modules that are able to perform a number of very specific tasks. So I think that the existence of a universal intelligence, at least in a biological sense, is questionable. But that leaves open the question of what does a GPT model represent, and since that is built on a universal computer, it's reasonable to say that it is a general intelligence. It is being fed with a lot of specific text in order to generate what it generates, but that text, there don't seem to be any real input constraints on what that text is, aside from people deciding what they're going to feed into it. So it could well be a universal intelligence, or the closest that we're going to get to that. But I think that's largely because it's based on something that's already universal, which is a universal Turing machine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just noticed that in your chapter, Grammar of Abstraction, the last section is about the grounding of abstraction. Can you tell me more about that?
Well, the abstract, we get. I would say this, thinking about the cell, that that ultimately these gene regulatory networks that may be controlled at a very high level by some kind of a master gene. I'll give you an example. I have 4 children. The youngest is my son, who has a condition called Fragile X syndrome. And this is a genetic condition, it's hereditary, and his body does not produce a particular protein. This one protein he doesn't produce, everyone else has it. And because he doesn't produce it, there are all kinds of effects that come out of that. Some of them are cognitive, some of them are social, some of them are physical. He has a very high palate, he has very loose joints, he has a particular shape to his face. He's got some autistic spectrum tendencies. So, I mean, there are lots of different things. And this is one protein. Mm-hmm. So how does one protein wind up having all of these effects? And the answer is that it regulates large cascades of other proteins, which in turn could regulate more cascades. And when we look at abstraction in any kind of a sequence, and this is a gene sequence, when we look at abstraction in any kind of a sequence, like the word freedom, we realize that it can mean a lot of different things, and that is highly context dependent, but ultimately it's all got to be grounded. And that is to say that at some point, these cascades of genes must result in some sort of metabolic activity. So in other words, if my son has a high palate as a result of the absence of this gene, then that is the result of some actual developmental process that led the palate to be that shape as opposed to a more normal shape. And so in that sense, this gene is grounded at the point where it comes, where it regulates development of the body, and in that sense, all of these very abstract concepts are grounded, and most of them are grounded. The ones that we put in that we think about as part of our language, they're grounded in the world through human bodies. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If we relate that to GPT-4, that is really just working in the space of language and not actually having a body, can we say that GPT-4 lacks that groundedness? And furthermore, can we say that GPT-4 may not be able to create new abstractions because it's never grounded? Or if it's grounded, it's only grounded in language?
Well, it is a strictly rate independent system, and it is not grounded. It's grounding to the extent that it is ever going to be grounded. It is going to be grounded in a loop that cycles through the humans that interact with it. So, and that is ultimately, I think, where any kind of linguistic grounding has to take place. In other words, if you make a query of GPT-4 and you get an answer, and you take some action that is based on that answer, you move your body in a certain way, you go someplace, you look up a book, you do whatever it may be that you do, you make a cake. That is how GPT-4 is going to be grounded. It needs to go through human bodies, because that is the only way that any kind of language is grounded.
Mm-hmm. But just connecting that, what about its ability to create abstractions? So it would be essentially creating abstractions through humans, the groundedness of humans and its feedback into the system itself.
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer. I mean, it's a very clever bit of software, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Can it develop further abstraction? In other words, one way of thinking about abstraction is the process of reclassification. So can it take several things and try to reclassify them into some new concept? Mm-hmm. Or is it simply going to spit out things that are related to concepts that it has already brought in as inputs? I don't recall having seen anything, but I wouldn't rule it out. It's awfully clever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's one of the open questions, because currently it's trained on a large corpus of text, but often the case is we want it to be able to create new abstractions from that text, or to sort of like think at a higher level. Because what I've seen is that normally when you ask it to explain something, it gets to a certain level of sophistication, but it's typically at a pedestrian level, but it's very difficult to push it to a higher level because it's simply unfamiliar with higher level concepts. And you have to do some workarounds to actually have it ingest a new concept.
I think I mean, if you think in the history of science, you think back to one of the ways that scientific progress has been made over the years is by finding two things that everybody thought were different and finding out that they're actually aspects of the same thing. So if you think back to Maxwell in the mid-19th century, up until that point, electricity and magnetism were thought to be two separate entities, didn't have any connection with one another. And then Maxwell put them together and said, no, they're really not different things. They're just two aspects of the same thing, which is electromagnetism. I've done that to a certain extent with my book, in the sense that I'm arguing that human language, particularly text, and the genetic system based on DNA are not two different things. They're two examples of one kind of thing, which is a system of sequences. So that's a level of abstraction or a reclassification. Now, would GPT-4, based on all of its many inputs, be able to do that? Would it be able to engage in literary criticism, which is one area where this sort of thing goes on all the time? I don't know. It'll be interesting as the capabilities increase and as the input corpuses get bigger and bigger, to see what can actually happen. I would not rule it out.